The Vethani scanner pulse hit us at 3:12 ship time, and I felt it the way you feel a hand moving through your coat pocket. Not painful, just deliberate and wrong. I was at my console in the sensor bay, 6 decks below the Pale Accord's command spine, watching the sweep bloom across my board in slow concentric rings. The Reach's probe frequencies were elegant. I had studied them for 8 months before we ever entered their approach corridor, and even now, knowing what they were designed to find, I found myself admiring the architecture. They didn't scan like a weapon sweep. They scanned like a question being asked very carefully in a language built for precision. The diplomatic hail was still live on the secondary channel. The Reach's contact node, a smooth, modulated carrier tone that the translation suite rendered as something between inquiry and formal greeting, had been transmitting for 11 minutes. Our response was pre-recorded, scripted by the Bureau of First Approaches, voiced by a synthesizer calibrated to read as unhurried and civilian. We had played it 4 times already. The Reach had acknowledged each iteration with the same careful patience, the way a very deliberate mind waits for a sentence to finish before it begins to process. 11 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. That was how long I had been running the profile. A Sovereign-class destroyer does not, in its natural state, look like a diplomatic frigate. The Pale Accord massed at roughly 11 times what our transmitted signature claimed. Our reactor output, in its normal configuration, would have lit up a Vethani long-range array from 6 light towers out. Our hull geometry, the low-slung weapons decks, the reinforced prow cowling, the paired engine nacelles designed for combat sprint rather than cruise, bore no resemblance to the slender, underpowered courier profile we were broadcasting. This was not an accident of design. The Pale Accord had been purpose-built for this assignment. Every emission source on the ship had been baffled, rerouted, or attenuated. The hull was dressed in layered metamaterial plating that scattered active scans and bled passive thermal returns into a configuration consistent with a modified Envoy-class diplomatic runner. We even broadcast low-intensity comm chatter on the frequency civilian ships used for internal routing, the background noise of a small crew going about unhurried business. I had built that noise. I had maintained it, adjusted it, let it breathe naturally over 11 months so that any record of our presence in Vethani-adjacent space would read as consistent and unremarkable. A frigate on a long courier run. A small ship with a small crew doing small work. The Vethani scanner pulse swept through us a second time. I watched my board and said nothing. There was nothing to say. This was the moment the mission was designed to reach. Not to avoid, not to survive, but to reach. We had filed no deceptions with the Bureau. The profile was authorized at the highest levels of the diplomatic corps and countersigned by Fleet Command. The Pale Accord was here because someone in a building on Earth had decided that the Vethani Reach, a distributed machine intelligence that had been processing humanity's existence as a variable in its consensus models for 6 years, deserved to learn something true. The question was whether we had chosen the right truth. The third sweep was different, slower, more targeted. I could see it on my board as a tightening, the Reach's probe frequencies converging on our drive signature first, then our reactor housing, then what should have been our forward cargo bay, and instead was our main gun assembly, sealed and cold, baffled behind 12 centimeters of signal-absorbent composite. They were reading the edges of things, the way mass distributes, the way a hull resists a probe at different angles depending on what's underneath it. I keyed the internal channel. Command, Kess, Sweep 3 is discriminating, they're pulling layers. Captain Solander's voice came back flat and even. Understood, hold station. Hold station. In 11 months I had never heard him say anything else when I flagged an anomaly. I used to find it frustrating. Standing orders, he had told me in the first week, the Pale Accord does not maneuver, does not accelerate, does not do anything that a diplomatic courier would not do. A frigate answering a scanner sweep with even a minor course correction would read as evasion, and evasion would tell the Reach something we were not ready for it to know. So we held, and the Reach kept pulling. The fourth sweep hit our reactor at full discriminating resolution, and I watched my board do something I had only seen in simulation. The Reach's probe return folded back on itself, a signature I recognized as the Vethani equivalent of a double take. They had gotten a reading they didn't believe, and they were running it again. Our reactor, even baffled to 1/10 of its nominal output, had a thermal signature with a specific harmonic. Civilian reactors don't produce that harmonic. Military reactors do, because military reactors are built to cycle fast under load, and that cycling leaves a trace in the residual heat bloom that no amount of baffling fully erases. You can dim it. You cannot make it disappear. The Reach had just found the harmonic. The diplomatic channel went quiet, not the silence of a system pausing to process. I had learned to read that in the first month, the regular 2 to 4 second gaps in the Reach's carrier tone that indicated computation rather than withdrawal. This was a different silence. Total. Every frequency the Reach had been using for contact dropped to 0 simultaneously. In a distributed machine intelligence with no individual commanders, every ship a node in a consensus fleet, simultaneous silence means the consensus is forming. Something is being decided, not by one mind but by all of them at once. I found that I was not afraid. I noted that fact the way I noted everything on my board as data, to be logged and considered later. The Reach ran a 5th sweep. Full spectrum, no discrimination, every probe frequency they possessed hitting us at once. It lasted 4 seconds. When it was done, I imagined they had a very complete picture. Mass, 11 times the declared figure. Reactor output, military grade baffled but present. Hull geometry, the scatter pattern of the metamaterial plating, read in aggregate across 5 sweeps, resolves to the frame of a sovereign-class destroyer if you know what you're looking for. The Reach knew what they were looking for. They had been building models of human military architecture from every intercept and observation available for 6 years. They knew what they had found. The silence held for 41 seconds. I counted. Then the Reach spoke, not on the diplomatic channel, on a frequency we had not given them, a frequency that corresponded precisely to the standard military hailing band for a sovereign-class vessel. They had looked up our ship type and found the correct frequency to address it. The message was 3 tones in a specific sequence. The translation suite took 8 seconds to render it, which was unusual. The suite typically resolved Vethani carrier tone messages in under 2. When the text appeared on my board, I read it twice before I keyed command. Query, what were you before you became what you are? I stared at that line for a long moment. It was not the message I had expected. I had prepared for silence, for a weapons lock, for withdrawal, for a formal protest on the diplomatic channel. I had not prepared for a question that sounded, in the translation suite's careful rendering, less like a challenge than like genuine inquiry. The Reach was not asking why we had deceived them. It was asking something older than that. Something that suggested its consensus models had just been rebuilt around a new variable, and it wanted to understand the variable more completely. Command, Kess. My voice was steady. They've addressed us by ship type on our military hailing frequency. Message reads, query, what were you before you became what you are? A pause on Captain Solander's end, longer than usual. Log it, he said. No response, hold station. So I logged it and we held. The Reach ran no further sweeps. Its consensus fleet, 14 vessels by our count, distributed across a volume of space roughly the size of a small solar system, did not maneuver, did not close, did not bring weapons to active status. What it did over the following 6 hours was reconfigure its sensor posture. The passive arrays that had been oriented toward us shifted, very gradually, to a wider field. They were no longer studying the Pale Accord specifically. They were updating their models of the entire approach corridor. We filed our contact report at 600. The Bureau acknowledged at 740 and flagged it for review at the senior level. Fleet Command acknowledged separately and designated the event a Category 1 calibration contact, the first in 7 years, the third in the history of the Reach relationship. The Reach withdrew from the corridor at 1200. Not quickly, there was no alarm in it, no retreat. The consensus fleet simply redistributed itself, as a tide redistributes when the pull changes, and by 1400 they had opened sufficient distance that our long-range arrays could no longer resolve individual nodes. They were still there, somewhere in the dark. They were thinking. I spent the afternoon writing my section of the contact report. It was detailed work. I logged every sweep, every frequency, every anomaly in the Reach's probe returns, every shift in their carrier tone patterns. When I came to the 41-second silence, I noted it with particular care, because in everything I had read about the Vethani Reach, 6 years of intercepts, academic analyses, 3 prior contact reports, the classified assessments the Bureau had shared with the Pale Accord's crew before deployment, I had never found a record of the consensus going fully silent for more than 12 seconds. They had needed 41 seconds to decide what we were. I thought about that for a while after I finished the report. What the Reach had encountered, if I had to reduce it to its simplest form, was this: a species that had spent 11 months being something it was not out of aggression, not out of fear, but because it understood that what you are and what you appear to be are tools, and tools are chosen for the task. We had worn the smaller face because a smaller face opens doors that a destroyer's prow does not. When the door was opened far enough, we had simply let our actual face be found. We had not revealed it. We had allowed it to be discovered, which is a different thing entirely. The Reach's question stayed with me. What were you before you became what you are? I don't know if the Reach intended it philosophically, or if the translation suite had smoothed something more clinical into something that merely sounded like reflection. But I found, sitting in the sensor bay of a ship that had spent 11 months pretending to be a smaller version of itself, that the question had an answer I hadn't expected to feel the weight of. We were always this. The frigate was the introduction, the destroyer was the truth, and the 11 months in between were the proof that we were patient enough to let you choose the moment you learned the difference. That, I wrote at the end of my section of the report, is what the Reach found when it scanned us. Not a deception, a demonstration. The Pale Accord held station in the corridor for another 72 hours, as ordered, before standing down the profile and returning to normal configuration. When we lit the main reactor to full output, the bloom would have been visible to the Reach's passive arrays at whatever distance they had retreated to. We made no effort to conceal it. We wanted them to see what we looked like with nothing on. I have told this account once in full to the Bureau's review board. They asked me, toward the end, whether I believed the Vethani Reach now understood humanity better than it had before. I told them I believed the Reach understood one thing better. It understood that the face humanity shows you at the beginning of a conversation is a choice, not a constraint, and that behind every choice we make about how to be seen, there is something larger and older and considerably more patient, waiting to be found. The board thanked me and closed the session. I went back to my console. Outside, the corridor was dark and very quiet, and somewhere in it, the Reach was still thinking.